Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. I am inside one of Battleship New Jersey's fuel tanks, and this is part of the ship's torpedo defense system. A torpedo defense system is most effective if it has depth. The width of American battleships was limited by the Panama Canal to 108 feet. So that limited the amount of depth they could have, because inside of the multi-layered torpedo defense system, you also need to have your engineering spaces, habitable spaces, everything else. So, because they were limited, the US Navy came up with, I believe, the most effective torpedo defense of any of the major powers. There wasn't much actual testing that took place on torpedo defense systems. So it really was wartime experience in World War II that proved what systems were good and what systems were bad. Unfortunately, by the time that had happened, all of the battleships that were ever going to be built had already been designed and started construction. So, a couple of different ideas exist about torpedo defense. Firstly, you want to mix up fuel-filled tanks, like liquid-loaded spaces, because that will absorb a lot of the explosion, and you need room for your fuel tanks anyway, and void spaces like this one, because a void space will allow an explosion to go out in all directions instead of being focused against an important armored bulkhead. On American ships, the two outer layers of their torpedo defense were liquid loaded. The two inner layers were void spaces. So the two outer layers would absorb all of the impact, and if they were damaged, those spaces would be the ones that would flood, but they're already full. And the internal spaces, if they get penetrated, there is still enough reserve of buoyancy that they can fill up if they have to, but it won't severely affect the ship. There are also pumps here which can transfer fluids from this side to the other side of the ship so you can counterflow. The US Navy used straight, usually vertical partitions. Other navies used curves. So for example, the British had a design called crushing tubes, where the tanks were liquid loaded and these round tubes were inside of them, which were void. So if there was an explosion, those would crush, and that would take the impact of the explosion. Because they were curved, though, it diverted the energy of the explosion around the tubes. And because these tubes were inside of the void space, you had to cut open the side of the ship to fix them, and it elongated the repair process. The Italians came up with a very similar design called a Pugliese cylinder. Pugliese was the inventor. Unfortunately, it wasn't tested before it was fitted to all of their most modern battleships. And as they learned at Toronto, that big circle, rather than crushing, forced the explosion to go under or around the top of the cylinder, which actually directed the energy against the seams that held the inner holding bulkhead to the top and bottom of the ship. And these seams could rupture and let water into the part of the ship where you don't want water. The battleship Bismarck, on the other hand, had a very primitive torpedo defense, but because she wasn't limited by any canals, it was very deep. So she was able to take repeated British torpedo hits on her belt without any significant damage. Another thing to consider with torpedo defense is the rigidity of your belt versus the elasticity of relatively thin armor. So on most ships, the belt comprises one of the layers of the torpedo defense, and that layer is one that should not be defeated. This is also where a lot of ships had issues. The belts are thickest at the waterline, but they taper relatively thin as they go underwater, which is the part where the torpedo hits. Then the bottom of these belts are attached to the bottom of the ship, and this seam is very vulnerable. This was a flaw in the Japanese super battleship Yamato. Also, many of these modern ships had angled belts, which made them more effective against torpedoes, against incoming projectiles, but more vulnerable to torpedoes, because a 90-degree connection is stronger than an angled connection where there's more force against the blast. Because of this, the Iowas, whose torpedo defense was not tested before they were put into service, probably don't have the best torpedo defense of all times. The battleships California, Tennessee, and West Virginia, which had the typical American 5-layer defense like the Iowas, where you have 2 outer void layers and 2 outer liquid-loaded layers and 2 inner void layers, because they were retrofitted wider than the Panama Canal, they had a deeper torpedo defense. Because they didn't have an angled belt, they had a stronger inner layer. And because they had this American system of multiple layers, they were more effective than, say, a Bismarck that only had 1 or 2 or 3 layers in most places. The Iowas were also ineffective when it came to torpedo defense because they were designed for high speed. Many battleships are designed to be wide as good gunnery platforms, but not particularly fast. This high speed meant that the ships had to be very narrow up forward, especially where turret number 1 is, so there was not enough depth there. A torpedo hit in this location would have probably flooded a significant portion of the ship. Thanks for hanging out with us today. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and click the bell icon to get more content from us and notifications when that content is coming out. If you have any questions, drop a comment down below in the comment section and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. Also, if you'd like the content we're producing and like what the museum is doing, consider checking out the description down below for a link where you can help support the channel. Thanks for watching.